Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. Promoting peace, liberty, and prosperity around the clock. LibertyTalk.fm.
Welcome to Living the Solution with Dr. Elena George. Today we have an important conversation. I think the last 2.5, 3 years have been very stressful for everybody. We've had changes in our healthcare system, access to healthcare, businesses have closed. I'm a small business owner myself, so I've been on the front line of the changes and trying to stay one step ahead and roll with the changes. And we have a lot of economic upheaval. And I wanted to have someone to come on to just give us a perspective, because this is, I think, unique. I don't remember ever having going through this, where businesses have been shut down and really the country was pretty much closed for months on end. And what does that mean for our future? What have we gone through? If you're in the midst of it, I think you're just living it, but you don't have a bigger view. And I want to make sure people have a perspective, because we have to navigate this in order to get back some kind of normalcy. So we're going to speak with Dr. Sutter. He's the Charles G. Koch Professor of Economics with the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. He's a Ph.D. graduate from George Mason University. His research has examined the societal impacts of extreme weather, the economics of the news media, and media bias, as well as the markets and economic research, environmental regulation, and constitutional economics. He's published over 100 articles in scholarly journals in economics, atmospheric sciences, civil engineering, and political science, and written or edited 4 books. He writes a weekly column on economics and public policy for yellowhammer.com and Alabama Today, and monthly column on Alabama economics and policy for 1819 News. He's the host of Econversations on Troy University's TrojanVision television channel, a show examining economic and policy questions. He's also a policy advisor for the Heartland Institute. So, Dr. Sutter, I want to thank you so much for joining me, because I think our conversation is one that maybe, as people don't know, but I have a feeling that knowledge is power. And if people can figure out why they're feeling some kind of way and know the historical background of what's going on and how we can navigate it, I think it would be very helpful. So thank you for joining me.
Well, I'm very glad to have on the show to be on the show. I'm happy to here to discuss this important topic with you.
Thank you. I want to go into the article that you wrote, Economic Freedom and the Pandemic. And first of all, am I really out there by thinking that this was really never happened in the history of our country in terms of the economic outfall?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, when you go back about 100 years to the Spanish flu, there were a few places, like a few cities that had some kind of a shutdown for a very brief period of time, like when that virus was raging very heavily in their communities. But the widespread shutdown of businesses, schools, and everything for months on end was completely unprecedented.
Now, before the shutdown, the economy was pretty much rolling along. It seemed like even the people who were on the fringe of society were benefiting from economic choice and freedom. And I want to go to one of the tenets of your article, economic freedom. What does that mean exactly?
Well, economic freedom really ultimately means the freedom to buy and sell the goods that you'd want to buy, and then also the freedom to sell your labor or to start a business and to trade with each other. And those economic transactions should be voluntary. And as we have to deal with each other, voluntarily and by convincing each other to want to trade with each other, to buy what we're selling, or to sell us what we would like to buy. And for about 30 years, the Fraser Institute in Canada has been trying to actually measure this, because we've known for decades, for hundreds of years, going back to the great economist Adam Smith, that economic freedom was important. But one of the big innovations was to try to come up with a way to actually score this, to actually try to measure which countries are more or less free.
And when you talk about freedom, to me, it seems the antithesis of, quote, a planned economy. And that seems to be something that we're moving towards in other countries. Is a planned economy more of a government centralized type of system? Because you're talking about freedom. That means if you decide you want to hang out a shingle as a doctor, you just do it. And when it's centralized,
Exactly.
that's being completely, it's that choice is being removed. Am I correct in thinking that?
Correct. Yes. Yeah. So what we're trying to measure with the measure of economic freedom is if there is a willing buyer and a willing seller, then that's all you need to make a deal. So if you want to hang out a shingle and somebody wants to come and patronize your business, then the two of you are the only ones who have to agree to this. To the extent that you have more people, especially government bureaucrats, who have to, in effect, give permission for such a trade to transaction to take place, then you're going to have less economic freedom. And if you want to think about the limiting case of very little economic freedom or no economic freedom would be a case of a planned economy, when you have the people running for people with the government actually trying to run or plan the entire economy. Because then decisions about what's going to be bought or sold or what's going to be produced are being made by government bureaucrats, not by you or I or people out there saying, I want to buy this, and somebody says, yeah, I'd be willing to sell you that.
Mm-hmm. It seems like it takes away innovation, because if someone's telling you what your worth is, arbitrarily, this particular business is, it's like climate change, for example. You can't have something that's oil based pretty much, and they're deciding the value of something, but it's not necessarily what people want to buy. Is that planned economy trying to coerce patients? I'm a doctor, or coerce patients, coerce buyers to change their habits, because it's not something that seems to be natural.
Yeah, and so if you're trying to, to the extent that you go in and interfere with the idea of a willing buyer or a willing, and a willing seller, and say, and somebody else imposes their preferences, saying, like, I don't want you to be able to buy that. I don't want you to be able to buy that gas-powered automobile. Then that restricts economic freedom. And there's a one case with some types of pollution you could point to and say, like, well, the issue comes down to one of property rights. And with certain types of pollution, you could argue that what's happening is, people are polluting the water, so they're in effect using that water to help, to dump chemicals into or dump waste into without treating it, and they're sort of like using that water maybe without permission. And so there are some types of cases of pollution where we'd argue, like, okay, you need to have some kind of some kind of extra decision making, some kind of extra voice for the people who say clean water is getting polluted, to be able to step in there, because otherwise that transaction with the willing buyer and the willing seller, well, that willing seller is ending up polluting something that they haven't actually purchased or gotten the rights to use.
Well, I know we're going to take a break in a minute, but I want to start the conversation with that willing seller. When it's corporate based, do you find that there's a difference? You're talking about an individual who may have something that, or a small group or a small company. Can you still think about that in terms of corporate America? Because I'm thinking really of things like Michigan, where they had tainting of their water supply. And that was something that was it was a broader devastation. It wasn't individuals, but nothing really happened to the entity or the companies that were causing this. No one ever served any time. Nobody ever had to pay a price. So it seems like it's a double standard. It's really applied to the individual because they don't have a lot of power. But when it comes to something bigger, it just seems to be they get a pass. And I know I'm going to have to take a break and have you answer that when we come back on the other side. You're living in the solution. Welcome back to Living the Solution. We're speaking with Dr. Sutter, and I'm sorry to have cut you off, but I wanted to give you a chance to think about that, because it seems there's, throughout our system, it's a double standard of some people are more equal than others, corporations specifically. So from that question, am I being sensitive in thinking that when it comes to a big, huge monolithic entity, they can do whatever they want, but the individual seems to pay the price more than anybody?
Well, I just think that's certainly partially true, and it deals and it addresses an element of economic freedom or a violation of economic freedom. And that is, the rules are supposed to apply to everybody, but one limitation to that is that if you are rich, or especially if you're a large corporation, you might be able to lobby politicians and in effect get the rules, change the rules from what they're supposed to be, or get yourself an exemption from a rule that applies to everybody else. Our economic freedom measure talks about this in terms of the rule of law. And the rule of law is, one way to think about it is everybody's supposed to be equal before the law. And, it's that rule of law and then enforcing and protecting people's property rights that really helps ensure that all of these transactions are going to be voluntary. And, nobody's supposed to be able to get around that. So I think, what you're voicing there is the fear that the powerful in our country, and is even far worse across the country, we across the world, because we do a lot better job of approximating this in the United States than in some countries. But the powerful, especially large corporations or maybe the wealthy, would be able to, in effect, buy unequal justice. Buy their way out of having to play by the same rules as everybody else, and that's a real problem. And we would try to measure that in our measure of economic freedom, and that is a definite issue, and that would certainly be a problem. One of the bigger problems, I think, that actually turns out to be the case is that it's not necessarily the larger corporations get exempted from the rules, but the fact is big companies have a lot easier time trying to deal with some of the rules than small businesses. When we look at when it comes to regulations, one of the biggest things is complying with those regulations. And large companies, are big, and they can afford to hire whole staffs of lawyers and other experts to just negotiate. Leave aside the possibility they're also going to give some campaign contributions to bend those rules, but just to comply with them, they're able to hire lawyers and other people who can simply do nothing else but help them comply with the law. If you're running your own business, a small business, you've got to attempt to try to comply with many of these same rules, and you've got to try to do it yourself in addition to trying to actually run your business. And so that burden of compliance actually tends to be really, really high on small businesses. Sometimes they can't actually fully comply with the law, and that leads them to be vulnerable to be shut down simply for not being able to comply with rules that it's just very, very hard for them to comply with.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you. The cost is sometimes prohibitive, and from the healthcare side of it, having to dot your I, cross your T. They change every year. You actually have to hire somebody to go through everything from your HR, your handbook to OSHA. I mean, it's really amazing. I mean, the hospitals and the surgery centers also deal with that. I can imagine you take that burden and you apply it across the different work forces across the country. It's amazing. I wonder who makes these rules. I mean, it's a kind of a esoteric question, but it doesn't seem the people who are actually on the front line of any business making these rules. How do they come up with them? Do they look at this from a global standpoint, or is this something it seems sometimes arbitrary?
For the regulations that we come from, well, that's a part of this quasi-permanent regulatory state, administrative state that different people talk about. I think President Trump has referred to the swamp, and some other people refer to it as a deep state. And that's part of it does come from legislation. Congress will pass a law, but a lot of times Congress passes a law saying, the Health and Human Services will write all these regulations to enforce the Affordable Care Act, or the new prescription drug rules for trying to lower the cost of prescription drugs. So Congress sometimes passes a law saying, authorizing the writing of regulations, but then the regulations are formulated by these regulatory agencies. A bunch of experts working for these agencies. Well, of course, we also know that many of them go back and forth to the big companies that they're regulating. So it's sort of a revolving door, and there's sort of like this permanent government, and it's not clear who they're really accountable to. It's difficult for Congress to necessarily exercise a lot of control over them. And these, they formulate these rules. They do have to follow a lot of administrative process in terms of formulating rule and publishing it and letting the public comment on it. But many times, even though they're supposed to respond to public comments, it seems like it's a done deal ahead of time that they've already decided what they're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sort of comes out of this like intersection of these, especially these like permanent bureaucracies and the bureaucrats. But again, like with the revolving door, many times it's the big companies that are being regulated, and people who are either have worked for them in the past or plan to try to work for them again in the future are writing a lot of these rules. A lot of times, with like big companies having the ability to have their lobbyists or their experts weigh in and help shape a rule that the average person doesn't get any voice on.
It seems like it's a conflict of interest just riddled through the system. And when you think about the pandemic, that's from the economic freedom side, I remember them pronouncing what an essential business was. And the essential businesses were interesting. In Georgia, for example, strip clubs were essential. Liquor stores throughout the country were essential. And the big box stores and the online market was open. But everybody else who had a brick and mortar, not everybody, but most people had a brick and mortar, had to shut down. How do you think that came to pass, that they could just pronounce who was essential?
Yeah, and that was in small scale or one aspect, this idea of central planning. The whole idea that there were some people maybe with the state public health department or maybe in consultation with some people from the commerce department or some people in the governor's office are going to get together and say, oh, what businesses are essential and we need to stay open and which ones can be closed. And, obviously, if you own a business, like your business is essential to you. And
exactly.
If you work for a business, and to say that business can be closed, I mean, that's sort of also saying like, well, you can be laid off. You don't need your job, but you need that job to help pay the bills and let you afford to live. And so, you had this. It is a part of it is just like this whole idea of central planning and the important, the relevant thing being that the people who think that they know enough to be able to make all of these decisions, they really don't know nearly as much as they need to be able to make these decisions. And so, you saw some really arbitrary decisions about like what was essential and what wasn't. I know in Pennsylvania they issued the decrees about who was essential, and then they immediately were rolling them back as like people were saying like, no, it's really important. We have to keep these other businesses open. And so it showed that they didn't really know enough, when they came down with these prescriptions about what was essential and what wasn't. And, I really wonder to what extent some of the supply chain difficulties we're having now, that these bottlenecks are from businesses that somebody didn't think was all that essential, that we could, non-essential and could be closed. And they stayed closed for a few months and they weren't producing what they needed. And then it turned out they were producing something pretty important that you can't make a car or a computer or a phone without now.
Exactly. And looking at or just referring back to the Canada-Fraser Institute and the measurements, I mean, there's like 5 different categories. If you can just go over that so people can get a bigger picture of what what constitutes economic freedom, what's measurements.
Sure. There's 5 areas. The first one is referred to as the size of government. So that's taxes and the amount of spending. And the second one would be the legal system and property rights. So that deals with this idea of the rule of law and do you have effective control over the stuff that you own, including like your business. The third area refers to money. It has to deal with money. And so things like money supply growth and the rate of inflation would be in there because you need to have a sound currency to be able to carry out transactions and exercise your economic freedom. The fourth area involves things with the international trade, and to an extent both trading and then movement of people across countries, and then also international finance. So areas with regards to the global economy. And then the fifth area deals with various kinds of regulation, whether it be labor regulation like from OSHA or healthcare regulation or environmental regulation. Those forms of regulation, I think often a big part of it is to look at labor markets and how free labor markets are.
And when you talk about in terms of the labor portion of the market, the two mindsets to me is a capitalistic view and a socialist view. Can you, I mean, I have a feeling how they both manifest, but is the socialist view more aligned with the central planning, with the centralized approach where it's all driven from one entity and then it just, goes out and everybody's has a value put on them or their services have a value put on them? Is that one way to think about how socialist policies are different from
Yeah.
economic freedom?
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it, because I think economists we actually prefer, we don't really necessarily like the terms capitalism and socialism, because what matters is what's the pattern of decision making. And so with markets and economic freedom, you have like decentralized decision making, and you have that willing buyer and willing seller, and if the two of them get together and they want to make a deal, that they can make a deal, versus the idea of some kind of centralized control. And with the decisions being made by the government, or whether it be our elected officials or probably bureaucrats who are going to be making these decisions for us. And at least the biggest ones, it doesn't mean they have to make every decision, but at least the biggest ones, the most important decisions might be being made by government officials centrally, and with commands going out to try to make people do what it is that the planners want them to do.
It doesn't seem like it's real time. I mean, I'm looking at this push towards green energy, for example. And my question has always been, and again, we're going to probably revisit this after the break, if they want to change our habits, could they not do this in a less disruptive way? Let it happen naturally. I mean, I guess they tried with giving you tax credits, etc., but it's still prohibitively expensive, and it still doesn't really accomplish what you want, which is to come off of oil or coal or some sort of energy that's not green, because it's all based off of those particular entities. So is there, from an economic standpoint, this movement towards green everything? First of all, my question is it really economically viable? And two, is there anything that we can do